Our story begins in a hospital whose name we don't know. But we know we are in an emergency room where the surgeons or doctors or nurses, I'm not sure who handles surgeries, but I guess it's the surgeon, right? We're asking about the patient's condition. Someone explained that he had lost a lot of blood and his blood pressure started to drop, which triggered that surgery panic I wouldn't want to be in. The surgeon asked for the forceps, and the blood pressure started to fall below normal. To make matters worse, there was an infection caused by a piece of metal, and if they delayed, the patient would suffer a cardiac arrest. You see, this is the madness of surgery. I don't have the nerves for it, honestly. I would end up accidentally killing the guy, and if you don't die along with him, I'd be the one having a heart attack. It seems the patient didn't make it, and the surgeons were already accepting his death. Meanwhile, in the waiting room, an old lady who was the patient's mother was begging the doctors to save her son because he had suffered so much because of a useless mother like her. She couldn't let him go because he was the only thing she had in her life. These words hit the surgeon hard, and they declared the patient dead at 10:49 p.m. And the cause of death was an infection after suffering an external wound leading to brain death due to excessive bleeding. At that moment, someone arrived saying the surgery wasn't over yet and they should get back to their stations. So they began the procedure again, explaining the patient's condition. Hearing the situation, this doctor with glasses declared that they could still save the patient. The nurse asked the same question I did. How can you save someone who is already dead? The other guy explained that the doctor standing before them was a bit different, because in terms of medical techniques, he was the authority. In other words, people called him the person who could save even the dead. But since that was a bit much, they nicknamed him the Hand of God, and his name was Jung. In the end, the guy really managed to save the patient. And of course, after reviving someone, he went to have a beer, right? However, as things turned out, he realized he wouldn't have a day off again. Actually, that day was supposed to be his day off, but once again he ended up stuck in an operating room all day. He realized his life was quite intense because of his skills and also because of the nickname Hand of God. That was the name given to him because he could save even the dead. At first, he didn't care much about it since the happiness he felt when saving someone on the brink of death with his talent was his motivation to keep going. However, he didn't get any rest after patients heard about this rumor, and as a consequence, he was always called upon to treat VIPs. They saw him as a portable medical device that could be used at any time. That's when he started to question whether the title Hand of God made sense to him because even the nearby doctors were afraid of him. He left the hospital and is currently an outcast. He doesn't even remember the last time he had time for himself. Of course, he earned a lot of money, but the bad thing was he didn't have time to spend it. He even joked that he had ruined his life in this timeline. If he was so dissatisfied with his current life, our dear Trunk C would help with that problem. Just as people say that at the moment of death, you see your life before your eyes, the only thing that passes through the protagonist's mind is countless surgeries. But at that moment, he starts to hear the sound of a beautiful bird, and someone starts calling for him with a voice he doesn't recognize. He realizes he hasn't died. However, the so-called hands of God were now very tiny. In front of him were a woman and a man he didn't recognize, and the woman was calling him Ray. It was Ray with an A, not an E. So it would be something like Ray-I. But I'm not going to keep saying Ray-A every time I mention the protagonist, so I'll just call him the protagonist, okay? Obviously, the mother, as always, thought her son was very cute, and the father, trying to keep up appearances, said he was very handsome just like him. But the protagonist wasn't understanding any of it because, as always, the last memory he had was after he left work and was hit by a truck. Then came the questions of how he was alive, who those people were, and what small body he was in. After putting his mind to work a bit, he realized he had been reborn as the son of that couple. But it was still very strange because, to the protagonist, they seemed to be cosplaying. At that moment, the protagonist noticed that his hand was a bit injured, and his father panicked, even though it was just a scratch. It wasn't that serious. Besides, she could heal him anyway. Hearing about healing, the protagonist asked if his mother was also a doctor. With his medical knowledge, he remembered that applying ointment to that little wound could leave some kind of scar. But who uses ointment in an isekai? His mother simply used healing magic. And that was when the protagonist realized that this wasn't medicine. Yes, magic. While the protagonist's mother was bragging to her husband, the protagonist was looking at his wound where there was nothing left. He realized that he had probably been reborn in another world. Now that I think about it, this scene of the mother healing and the boy looked just like that scene from Mushoku Tensei, didn't it? It's identical, but different. Sometime later, already at night, after all this situation, the protagonist was a little calmer. In reality, he was awake because he hadn't slept in a long time. Also, it had been 3 months since he reincarnated in that world, and during this short time, he learned a few things. The first thing is that this world is different from where he came from. It was a typical fantasy world with monsters and subspecies similar to humans. Consequently, people are easily attacked by monsters, and as a result, people choose paths dedicating their lives to becoming stronger. An interesting point about all this was that the vast majority of people decided to develop magic more than science. That's why every time the protagonist gets hurt, his mother always heals his wounds with magic. But for the protagonist, this was bad because they rely too much on magic instead of medical techniques that have evolved over time. The problem wasn't just that they used magic for everything. Putting that aside, the protagonist realized that all of this was not a dream, but indeed his new reality. However, for some reason, he managed to keep his memories and knowledge from his past life. That's why he was feeling this sensation of relaxation again because, due to his job in his past life, he was always busy and never had a chance to have fun. If it weren't for that car accident, he would probably have died of exhaustion. So for him, this was almost like a forced vacation. But when the protagonist started to sleep, something strange began to happen. It was something very thin passing through his body along with a sensation of cold that left him invigorated. Since the protagonist didn't know what this sensation was, it was probably mana, right? It didn't seem to be easy to control, and if he tried to force it, it would spread everywhere. Therefore, he should focus exactly on where the mana thread begins and ends. The protagonist made an analogy thinking that mana probably worked the same way as blood. So he tried to let the mana flow like a bloodstream and tried to feel it filling his body. He did this slowly and steadily, and of course, this was his first experience with mana. Seasons passed until, in the end, he finally managed to summon a bit of fire, and he was very happy because he didn't know he would be able to do that since he had only seen it in movies, manipulating mana to cast a fire spell. Even though he had tried for 3 years in a row, he managed to understand the mana flow and memorize the possible paths it could take. But he couldn't understand that book explaining how mana manipulation worked. The book said to store mana inside his body and manipulate it as needed since mana should be drawn from the surroundings. But then a question arose. Why should they store mana in their bodies? It seemed like some kind of limitation because they had to store it in their bodies, and their bodies had to sustain everything. So, in short, it was very inefficient. Then he thought, wouldn't it be easier to let the mana flow naturally without trying to contain it, simply attracting the mana around and using it? In this case, he wouldn't have to worry about a mana circle or something like storage. Obviously, this was a hypothesis from the protagonist because he hadn't seen any of it in the books, but it was worth trying. Now, from another angle, the protagonist's mother was very proud that her son was studying, declaring that he was destined to become a mage. But his father wasn't very happy, as he believed that with his body, he needed to become a swordsman. Man, I'm telling you, this is very similar to Mushoku Tensei, isn't it? Even the parents have the same idea for him. Back to the story, the two started arguing, and hearing this argument, the protagonist wondered what was the point of hiding since he could hear their entire conversation. However, the protagonist's mother was worried about something. The protagonist invested a lot of his time in books. Or rather, she meant that children his age should go out and play with friends, but the protagonist just stayed there reading books. On the other hand, his father declared that she shouldn't worry since most people were concerned because children didn't like to read. Besides, he could become a good mage like she wanted, but his mother was still a bit worried. Meanwhile, the protagonist was still searching for a way to create a perfect path for mana flow. The next day, the protagonist's mother asked how he was doing. As always, he was there reading a book, and she was proud of him for doing that and everything. Still, a part of her wanted him to make new friends and play around. Or maybe she should start with herself. So she approached the protagonist and asked if he wanted to play with her today. Hearing this, the first thing the protagonist thought was, wow, is she trying to teach me magic? She was definitely trying to play with me just to teach me some magic. Poor guy, he only knows how to study. So he accepted, right? However, seeing his enthusiasm, his mother felt a bit sad, declaring that if she had known he was so desperate to play with her, she would have done it earlier. But a while later, the protagonist realized he had misunderstood everything and was wondering why he was standing in front of the door. His mother responded that it was obvious he should play outside. The protagonist insisted that he needed to study a bit more. After all, he couldn't waste time while he should be practicing. His mother was very proud that he was such a studious child, but she said that today it was okay, and he should see a bit of the outside world. Reflecting on this, the protagonist realized that he had never left the house since reincarnating and didn't even know what his new world looked like. With that, he couldn't say no, right? When the protagonist stepped outside, he saw how beautiful the place he was in was. For 3 years of his life, he had spent reading at home and never thought of leaving it. In the end, he was trapping himself in his own cage. His mother asked what he was doing because it was time for him to explore that world. So, the protagonist started running through the beautiful and vast field, and he was extremely happy. He ended up finding a forest and reflected that before reincarnating, he never had a chance to take care of himself because he was forced to survive under the pressure of others. Surviving was the best he could do, so he had never felt so free before. Nevertheless, he was very happy to have been reborn in that world, and, of course, the protagonist thanked his mother for taking him outside. A little while later, the protagonist was reminiscing about his past life again. It was a repetitive life where he was always with patients all day and in surgeries, of course. Because of that, he was always exhausted, and the poor guy was so tired that he fell asleep in his mother's lap without even realizing it. His mother asked if he was having some kind of nightmare. Well, I think it could be considered one because he worked like a convict. The protagonist was in a completely different place, and he was very happy to have been reborn in that world because he definitely wasn't going to live as he did in his previous life. Sometime later, they returned home, and the protagonist, not wanting to miss the opportunity, quickly pulled his mother, saying, "Mom, please teach me magic." With that cute face, the protagonist practically knocked her out, and she fainted in her husband's arms, saying that her son was very cute. She was, of course, very happy to teach her son, but the protagonist was still a bit unaccustomed to making these kinds of faces to try to convince people. His mother, and the first magic that the protagonist's mother taught him, was none other than fire. However, seeing his mother's magic, he wasn't that motivated, and she was a bit surprised. She even declared again that they were going to learn about fire, but the protagonist kept the same reaction. She was a bit confused because theoretically, it was supposed to have a big impact on him. The problem was that the protagonist had already used this magic a few times, so it wasn't that impressive to him. Nonetheless, she was going to teach him anyway. She started to explain that magic is something you want to use and transform into mana. For example, the word fire serves as a kind of trigger that generates an action. The protagonist asked his first question, wondering if he couldn't transform magic into mana using a different method. His mother didn't understand very well what kind of method he was talking about, so he tried to explain. For instance, with fire, people generally burn mana, gather it, and then want it to combust, applying friction in the end. But instead of transforming mana 3 times, shouldn't there be a slightly faster method? Since processing it 3 times would be inefficient and it would also disperse. His mother was surprised by this kind of question because it seemed quite advanced. But thinking about it a bit, it wasn't impossible. Of course, if the 3 events were grouped into one, it would be possible, but only in theory. Thinking about it a bit more, the protagonist thought that if he added another attribute in a complete state, he might actually succeed. And indeed, he did. Even his father appeared, asking what was happening. His mother, however, was still confused because she hadn't noticed the mana flow before the protagonist used the magic. Normally, when using magic, mana flows occur, and she was quite sensitive to magic, but she hadn't felt that movement. The protagonist entered his world, saying it was easier to understand if you thought of it as an atom and combined composite mana. He started talking a lot of nonsense, and seeing her son talk like that, his mother wondered what kind of child he was. She was even starting to feel sad, but the protagonist noticed this and obviously asked if she was okay. She replied that she was, just very proud of her son. Later that night, the protagonist overheard a conversation between his parents questioning what they should do if the protagonist were taken to an academy at such a young age. His father declared that they should do their best, acknowledging it wouldn't be easy since the protagonist was a genius who appeared once every 100 years, maybe every 1,000 years, and if he drew too much attention from the academy, he would probably be taken away from them. The protagonist didn't know what kind of place this academy was, and to avoid being dragged there, he needed a lot of power. Until now, he had been learning magic for fun, but now he changed his mind. He needed absolute power. So the day began, and the protagonist had just woken up. It wasn't just another day. Now the protagonist was 15 years old, and his hair had turned snowy white. Now we need to know more or less what happened during this time, right? First, the experiment the protagonist was attempting in the beginning progressed. Thanks to his genius understanding of mana, it proved to be the foundation for his extremely rapid development. Due to the insane amount of mana absorbed during this short time, his hair turned pure white. It's like Saitama, except he kept his hair and it turned white. Leaving this idea aside, the protagonist didn't know if his medical knowledge would be very useful in this world, but it was worth trying, right? However, before he went, he would test once more. So he invoked fire, wind, and ice and combined them all into one. He felt powerful as if he were the master of the world. Then the protagonist went to the city and found an appropriate place to earn money. He felt a bit embarrassed since it was his first time, but he couldn't keep his mouth shut. So he started shouting that he could heal anyone who wasn't feeling well, and everyone around was very happy. Some commented that the protagonist should place Saint somewhere else because he shouldn't provoke sick people that way. This took the protagonist by surprise, but obviously nobody knew him. He hadn't done anything to prove himself yet and wanted to seem credible. However, he waited a bit longer since he had medical knowledge. It's like the old saying, in the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is king. But I think the protagonist doesn't remember that this saying only worked in our world. Obviously, he didn't get any clients. Just when he was about to give up, a girl came, asking if he could really heal someone who was sick. She also questioned if he cared about the type of patient. Since the protagonist wasn't responding, she asked again. The protagonist replied that he needed to at least examine them first. From his response, she started judging him, saying that from his appearance, it was obvious he couldn't heal anyone. This got the protagonist a bit flustered, and he called her short because he also had to pay in coins, right? And he started saying that he might look like a useless 15-year-old on the outside, but there wasn't a single patient in the world that he couldn't cure. So she shouldn't judge people by their appearance. Seeing him a bit closer, the girl felt a strange sense of confidence coming from the protagonist. Since he was speaking with such conviction, she decided to accept his services. First, she introduced herself. She was the only daughter of Viscount Gad von Alicia. Obviously, he shouldn't call her Shorty. With that, the protagonist apologized and introduced himself as Ray. However, leaving that aside, the patient she was asking the protagonist to cure was none other than her father. Some time ago, the skin on his chest turned red and developed a lump, which then swelled up like a balloon. From the description, the protagonist thought it might be a malignant tumor. So the protagonist declared that he should take a quick look because if it was an emergency, every second counted. What worried him was the idea of a tumor the size of a balloon because that could mean it was too late. Sometime later, the protagonist arrived at her house, and what a house it was. At first, the house butler called Alicia, and in her desperation, she asked the butler how her father was doing. At that moment, the butler declared that his condition had suddenly worsened, and he had passed away. This surprised Alicia, who then ran inside her house and reached her father's room, where her mother was crying a lot. She didn't want to believe her father had died. However, the protagonist asked if he could quickly take a look at him. Looking at the tumor, the protagonist felt a strange aura. Using magic, he sensed that it was still weak, but he could feel a slight sign of life. So he declared to everyone that the Viscount could live. This surprised everyone in the room, especially Alicia, who begged the protagonist to save her father. Given the situation, it was obvious that the protagonist wouldn't back down. Unlike Alicia, the people there didn't have much faith in the protagonist, questioning what a commoner was doing in the Viscount's house. However, some tried to believe in the protagonist, asking how he could save the Viscount who was already dead. Alicia's mother simply declared that they should stay quiet because it didn't matter now. She just didn't want to lose hope. Perhaps that child in front of them could perform a miracle, guess. From the protagonist's perspective, He couldn't believe that tumor had grown so much because it was so large and rotten that it was black. However, leaving that aside, he needed to focus his mana to form a scalpel. Seeing the protagonist invoking a blade, everyone was shocked, asking what he was doing. The protagonist was confused, saying he was trying to save him, but nobody understood how he could treat using a blade. The protagonist just asked them to stay quiet and trust him. When someone was about to speak again, the Viscount's wife told him to be quiet because they should try to trust the child. And since he was in the way, he should stay back. Returning to the protagonist's perspective, he noticed there was pus instead of blood from the tumor. So it wasn't a tumor anymore, but rather dead skin because of poison. It was time to work. The protagonist began his procedure. First, he needed to get rid of the rotten parts. Everyone watching the procedure was completely shocked. Meanwhile, the protagonist made an incision and found the root of the problem. The situation was so bad that even the Viscount's lungs were rotting, but fortunately, it was just one, so he was somewhat lucky. Since the rotten part wasn't too big, the Viscount could recover even if the protagonist cut that part out. After he made the cut, he obviously needed to close it, but he didn't use a normal suture. Instead, he used a mana stitch. Everyone watching the procedure was speechless. The butler even commented that he was without words because, to him, the protagonist was not only charismatic, but also masterful with his hands. In a few words, he was like a marionettist good at controlling puppets. He could also be seen as almost a god. Watching everything in front of him, the butler commented that the boy could indeed perform a miracle, and even the maid agreed. The protagonist was almost done and just needed to help with the circulation. Therefore, he used mana like an AED, automatic external defibrillator. The protagonist started the heart massage, and after a small charge, the Viscount's heart started beating. The protagonist was very happy, declaring that the Viscount was alive and the surgery was a success. However, the people there were more shocked than happy. Looking around, the protagonist understood why. It was because the Viscount was bleeding, but the reason wasn't that he was dead. As soon as his blood began to circulate again, people started yelling at him, especially the guy who had been a nuisance at the beginning, declaring that he knew the protagonist was just a fraud. The protagonist was trying to explain himself, but nobody was letting him speak. The protagonist tried to say that the Viscount was indeed alive, but the ignorant ones didn't believe him. They didn't want to listen to the protagonist at all, and he was getting fed up with the conversation. Even Elysia followed the annoying guy's lead, commenting that she had believed the protagonist could save her father. She trusted him, but the protagonist kept saying that he wasn't dead. However, Elysia stopped believing him and declared that her father was dead because she had brought the protagonist there. The protagonist was still trying and reflecting that it was normal in a surgery. Had they ever seen a surgery before? The situation began to heat up, and a sword was pointed at the protagonist, declaring that he was not only harming the Viscount, but also the lady. Did he think it wasn't enough to desecrate the Viscount's body? Hearing this, the protagonist got really angry and declared that he had gone through the trouble of saving him. And we'll see it in the next episode. Remember to subscribe and leave a like.